Hi everyone, welcome back to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. As you recall, last week we talked about binding. We're going to keep working through those lessons. Today we're going to talk about adding binding to a quilted project. But make sure when you do the preparation of your binding that you do a couple things. Make sure that you have enough length so that you can go all around the outside edges, and that's what we talked about last week. We also talked about joining the seams. Make sure that you use angled seams when you join one strip to the next, and make sure when you press that you're pressing those raw edges nice and even. And if you like the method that I'm going to show you today, which is the tuck method for the ending of the binding, what you're going to want to do while you're at the ironing board is you're going to want to add one more press. And I add that press at the beginning, and it's about 1/4 of an inch. And what it does is it makes a little pocket in my binding, and you can kind of guess what that's going to lead to down the way. But do that prep for the binding, but also there's a couple of things you want to do for your quilt itself to make sure you're prepped and ready for the binding. First of all, no matter whether you quilt this or whether you send this off to be quilted, make sure that your quilt has a line of basting stitch right along the edge. That's going to help keep these 3 layers acting as one layer when you're adding the binding. One of the things that I always do before I clean up and trim my edges is I take my quilt to the ironing board and I give it a good press first. And then once I've got that nice and flat, that's when I'll come back and trim those edges of the backing and the batting away so that they're even with the quilt top. And I always use a big square ruler around the corners to make sure that I get a nice true 90-degree cut. So once you have prepped your binding and you've prepped your quilt top, there's one more thing that you have to do. Make sure that you either add and attach a walking foot, an even feed foot, or if you have a newer machine that has that built in, make sure that you engage those feet, the even feed, dual feed foot, because you've got actually 5 layers that you're going to be trying to keep even and straight as you work your way around. You have 2 layers on your binding and you have 3 layers here, which again should be basted together. All right, so how do I start mine? Well, what I do with mine, because I'm doing the tuck method, is I'm just going to start stitching around the edge. But one of the things you might want to consider doing before you start your actual stitching is I do a little bit of a walk around. I'll pin a starting place, and then I'll come and I'll just kind of walk my binding around the edges. On a small project, it's pretty easy to walk around 3 or even all 4 of the edges to make sure that none of those joining strips are going to end up at a corner. If it's a big quilt, I'll probably go around the first 2 corners and keep my fingers crossed that I'm not going to hit one of those corners with a joining strip. And maybe we'll do a lesson on how you do that, what happens if you, and how to fix it if you do end up with a joining strip at the corner. But so I've already done that with this binding here. So I'm just lining up that folded edge that I have right with the edge, and I'm going to do the stitching. Now, one of the things when I do the stitching, I will do the first 4 or 5 or 6 inches of the binding onto the quilt. But then what I'm going to do before I go too far is I'm going to check to see how wide my stitch is. I want that to be wide enough so that when I take my binding and I wrap that folded edge around the edge, I like to have that folded edge come right to that stitching. If when I do those 4 or 5 inches, I wrap it around and I'm at the edge, but I'm seeing a lot of the thread, then I know my width, my stitching width is too wide. If when I wrap this around, that folded edge comes way down beyond the stitching, I know that I'm going to have a skinny binding on the front and a fat binding on the back. And that's not what I prefer. I like to have the look of the binding be even on front and back so that that folded edge comes right to the line of stitching. So, a lot of practice, having bound several hundred quilts, I pretty much know where that is on mine. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is how you're going to turn the edges. And this is pretty standard. So I'm going to take this. I'm going to position this underneath and work my way down a little closer to that corner. And I'm stitching, keeping all the edges nice and even. When I get about an inch or two away from the corner, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 2 marks to turn my corner. I'm going to make 1 mark straight at the edge of the quilt. And then I'm going to make a second mark at 45 degrees. It's basically splitting the difference between this edge and this edge with a line. And that way, no matter how wide your stitching is, if you're doing miniature and you're going to have a very narrow stitch, you'll be right there. If it's a little wider, but that diagonal line is your start point for your miter binding that you're going to do as we stitch here. So I'm going to stitch to that line. When I get there, back out. I might put a few more stitches in and then remove the piece from under the needle. Let me put this underneath so I'm ready to start the next one. Here's what you do to turn that corner with the continuous binding. Take the quilt out from under, rotate it so that it's lining up as if it's going to be for your next line of stitching. And you're going to put 2 folds into your binding strip. The first fold you're going to put in will have you taking that binding strip and moving it up and away so that you're putting in a 45-degree fold in your binding strip. Once you have that 45-degree fold in, you're going to take the binding strip and bring it down toward you so that the second fold is right against the edge of the quilt. So you have a 45-degree fold, and then you have a straight fold going across there. And because that 45-degree fold is already in there, you are then ready to put this underneath, and you can start right at the edge. I'll frequently give that a little bit of a back tack too, so I know that it's nice and firm in there. And then I'm going to start working my way around the project, keeping all those edges even. The 2 edges of this, the 3 edges of the quilt. And you know, there's one other thing that I do when I'm working my way around. These dog ears are left from the joining seam. What I will do is I'll take those and trim those off as I work my way around. And I'll just continue working my way around the edge, turning all my edges in exactly the same manner. And what I'd like to do now is not finish this particular one, but show you on a different project how I go about doing the finishing. So what I'm going to do, I've got my stitching up to here. I still haven't trimmed those dog ears, but I will. Here is my start, and you can see there's the fold that's in there. I'm going to bring my stitching down, and I'm going to stop my stitching at about the halfway mark between those 2 folded edges. So let me pick the presser foot up, put this down here. I've used on this for video purposes, I'm using a very light thread that contrasts with my dark binding. But you know, if I were doing this for real, I would put a thread color that matches my binding strip on the top, and I would put a thread color that matches my binding strip on the back. Again, I have different colored threads in here so that you can see what it is I'm doing. Now, when I get close, I'll come back. Remember, my start-stop point is about halfway here. When I get close, doesn't have to be perfect, I'm just going to make a mark on my binding so I know where I am, and get to there, do a back tack, take it out, and to finish this, all that I need to do, I always make this as an angled cut. I come back, put that 45-degree angle on there, and just snip right along that edge, and then I can just take that piece and tuck it right into the fold that let's get that pocket open and tuck that right into there. And of course, because I'm trying to show you, it's being hard to get along with. And there's my angled seam on there that I'll do a little bit of hand tacking, and I'll show you that next week when I talk to you about how you do the hand stitching and how you go about turning the corners. So I hope that this helps you going forward. You know what? I think we're actually going to do a special treat next week. Next week, we're going to have Sarah, and she and I are going to change places. I'm going to be behind the camera, and she's going to be here, and she's going to show you her way of turning the corners, which is almost exactly the same, and her way of doing the starting and the stopping on the project. So, hope to see you all next week. Get those projects finished so you can practice your binding as we're working along here, and have a good week, everybody.